Hello, my name is Sarah and I'm really glad that you decided to check me out for the possibility of learning the string bass. This is a series of one of 3 videos. I'll be recording one for each instrument that I teach. Today we're going to be talking about the string bass. And just so that we're on the same page, the first thing you probably want to talk about is naming, because out of all the instruments in the world right now, in the Western world, this is probably one with more names than I'm completely familiar with. So if you come from the classical world, the language is typically Italian or German for the score. So contrabasso or contrabass are typically the most common names, which anglicized is contrabass, meaning double bass, which is why it's very commonly called a double bass. Why double? Well, the bass member of the traditional string family, which are all Italian instruments, the violin, viola, and violoncello, all come from a different family, a slightly different family than this, and its lowest notes are not as low as this, so it's double down the bass. Pretty easy name. It's also sometimes called the string bass to separate it from other bass instruments, such as the tuba or the bass trombone. In the jazz world and in more contemporary settings, it'll sometimes be called upright bass or stand-up bass, even if you're sitting down. And some of the crazier names you might hear, if you happen to be from the rockabilly or country worlds, you might even hear it called a bass fiddle, or even a bull fiddle, or a doghouse. I don't entirely know where those all come from, but I do know that they're all the same instrument, and this is what we're going to be talking about. So, as I mentioned, there's a slightly different musical family for the rest of the stringed instruments. And the main differences are the slopes up here that lead up off the neck. The corners of the instruments are typically smoother, but modern instruments are sometimes different. And the tuning is the most common part. There's also one other bit of historical information, was that the bow for this other family of Germanic, Middle Eastern instruments called the gamba family was typically held underhanded because it had more strings and you needed it for volume. Now with steel strings and better construction, you can use the overhand bow we call the French bow technique, which is what I specialize in, which is more similar to a cello bow or violin bow. But the big difference in the tuning has more to do with its origins. These two notes, and these two notes are all the same distance apart, but that's a different distance than is used in the other strings, which the lowest strings of an open string of a cello sound like this. Obviously they go up from there, which is the main difference why it's called, again, a contrabass, such a lower instrument. So that's a lot of the background information that you might want to know if you want to impress your friends or just make sure that you know where you're coming from. And of course, as you probably are familiar with, this is a common instrument in an orchestra, as well as in the jazz world, where you tend to play with your fingers a little more. But they have the same role, which is a supporting foundation role, and if you happen to find yourself drawn to that role in a band, in an ensemble, in an orchestra, this is a great instrument for you, and I happen to be very fond of it. The next thing I want to cover is the parts of the instrument. We start from the top, and up here is what we call the scroll area of the instrument, because typically it ends in a scroll, and specific designers will have different scroll designs. It's probably right here is the only aesthetic part of the instrument. Everything else is functional. Down here we have tuning posts that come directly down and back, which also differ from the cello and the other instruments, which typically are smaller pegs out to the side. Each one turns a small gear, which tightens or lowers the post on the inside here, which will tighten or loosen the string. And of course, in order to get to precise tuning, you'll need to be able to tighten these as needed, depending on things like the weather or just the general stretchiness of the string. And the last part right here, we call this the nut, sometimes called the saddle. And this is simply the spot where the string bends or cuts down and begins the vibrating part. This is the most important part of this here is kind of to help gauge where you should be playing for your comfort as well. I typically play with my nut lined up with my eye because of my longer hand. You may find that it goes all the way up to the top of your head depending on how well your bowing hand should work. And in addition, these bends also can help dictate. As soon as you put this bend in, you've changed the sound of the string itself, which is why if you end up buying a used string, and I think bass players are probably the only ones that will buy used strings because of how expensive they are and how much metal is in them. But if you do get a used one, it will sound just a little different than if it was new because of the bend put in by the instrument. Going further down, now the length of the string follows what we call the neck, which is obviously the long and supportive side, and the fingerboard, which is what we technically call that separate piece of wood that is laid on top of the neck and extends further down, that we actually hold the string down when we play. This is kind of important because on most instruments where you get a more natural color of wood and not this particular instrument, you'll see a color difference where the fingerboard is laid on top of the neck. So down here past the fingerboard, just past it, is your optimal bowing area for most of your notes. And this is simply because of the optimal spot where the string will vibrate looser. The closer you get to the next piece we're going to talk about, the bridge, the tighter of a sound you get, which is helpful on the higher notes. Typically, if you're playing primarily with your fingers, as a jazz player would do, you may play just on top of the fingerboard slightly before it, and I can show you the subtleties of these techniques during later lessons. The next piece is the bridge. This is a solid piece of maple that is actually significantly more important than it looks to non-string players. This is because the vibration of the string is transmitted down this piece of wood. The vibrations go down to a couple of internal parts, which we call the sound post and the bass bar. You're not going to be able to see them very well until you see one in person, but there's a post, a dowel, that runs directly through, just underneath where this foot is on the bridge. It goes to the back of the instrument, vibrates the back panel, the back table, and vibrates it forward, out through the top, through these holes. And that's where you get the projection of the instrument. This is also why typically orchestral players will use a mute that suppresses the vibrations at the bridge itself for a different color. Many composers have begun doing that. Past the mute, you'll see some accessories that I find are typical for the all-around bass player, which is the strings will go to the metal tailpiece here, which also help transmit vibrations to the instrument. I also have installed pickup and preamp as well as a quiver for holding my bow. You are not required to have any of these pieces, but you may find them useful the more you study. And that's the basics of the pieces of the instrument. Next basic I'm going to show you about is bows. Now the bow is, as I mentioned, an important part. I do ask that jazz players that are going to primarily perform with their fingers still consider getting a basic fiberglass bow. Something that's durable with real horsehair is important. And I can show you exactly some of my favorite places to get these sorts of things. And the main reason being is that you can kind of cheat your intonation more if you're just plucking, and it really won't train your ears properly unless you use a bow. So, as I mentioned, there's two kinds of bow. There's the underhand grip bow, where this grip will be longer, more able to get two fingers inside of it. You hold it like this. It's called a German bow or even a butler bow sometimes, whereas I specialize in the French bow. You can use either one. I can show you how to use either one. That's not a problem. It's just that I typically only perform with my nicer model French bow. So in order to get a bow to work, you're going to need to do two things. You're going to want to make sure that it's tightened properly. When you store your bow, your hair should be slack. You can actually see some of that loosened up. There's a screw on the end of it that'll help you tighten it until you want to tighten it until you can just draw across and produce a note. But you're not going to get any sound out of it without rosin. This is one of my favorite brands of rosin here. Base rosin is a little different. It tends to be very soft compared to most other types of rosin. But when you're just beginning with a new bow, you'll need to be able to get some movement out of it. So this particular brand, you can just push up, and once it's tightened, swipe it across maybe 1 or 2 times. The heat from the swipe will apply rosin to the hair. And all rosin is it's a sap, or in this case, this is a synthetic rosin for people with allergies and dust problems like I typically have. But all that does is it will help, the friction will help get the rosin into the hair, which at full tautness will allow you to draw a clean note. So as I said, jazz players should be expected to have at least a basic bow. Classical players can start with the same bow, especially for the younger students. That's going to be necessary because if you're buying a smaller bodied instrument, such as a 1/4 or 1/2 size instrument, you'll want a bow that matches that size. And those are instruments typically used by kids, teenagers, or very small adults. The typical size is a 3/4 bass, unlike other instruments, whereas you will occasionally find a 4/4 bass, but it is probably too tall for you for most players. And that pretty much wraps up everything you'll need to know before your first lesson. So feel free to send me an email or give me a call if you want any more information before your first lesson. We can go over anything that you might have missed or want more information on. And that way, all of this information I hope will help you as you begin to make your decision as to what teacher to find and perhaps where you can start. So I'm going to leave you with one simple activity. If you have a bow already, I think this would help you as well. If you want to do it with your fingers, you can. And all you simply want to do is you want to find a point that's easiest for your hand, where you can play a very simple exercise. Start with your lowest string, and all you want to be able to do is be able to play one note cleanly with one finger, use your thumb for support, and be able to play use your additional fingers, your index finger, your middle finger, and then your pinky finger, all along one string. The higher you can go, the more muscle development you'll be able to get. This will help warm you up for our first lesson. You'll feel a little bit of buildup in your fingers, but that's okay. Don't hurt your fingers, warm up slowly. I think that's all I've got for you today, so go ahead and give me a call, send me an email. I'm available pretty much all the time. Again, my name is Sarah, and thanks for watching this video.